We're live.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris
Oh,
Anderson. It's not in London.
not in London.
I'm not.
Calling Chris Anderson in an undisclosed location.
Yes, it's my secret command bunker here, deep underground.
Where
No,
are you?
I'm in New York, way up north.
Are there 10,000 men there with you?
There are.
I'm
Gonna
marching
march
up
up a hill.
and
We're going down a hill again.
I figured.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody, to History
Thank
Happy
you.
Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I may travel the globe all the way to York.
I'm going to New York.
We still manage to get here every Sunday to have a cocktail and talk about history. And today, I'm really excited about today's show because we'll be talking to one of the original freedom riders from 1961. And I just want to give a big thank you to the list of folks who are supporting us via Patreon, Chris, especially our top shelf sponsors or patrons, our top shelf patrons.
Yeah, we have a spot down there in the lower left if anybody...
I know, we need more top shelf patrons, but we appreciate all of the patrons, whatever support level, who help us to keep the history taps open here on History Happy Hour. And Chris, do we have anybody watching, or is it just you and I at this point?
Well, no, we have a lot of people watching. Gene Templin from Pennsylvania, Nancy, it's good to see you back here. I haven't seen you post for a while, so Nancy's back. Lynn Kennedy, Ken from Kansas, Doreen, Doug McCord, folks from all over. So, yeah.
So excellent. We have Ken from Mobile, Alabama, and of course Marcus is here. So we're getting a good crowd of people. And Chris, do you think that we have killed enough time here that we can actually play our open and start the real show?
Absolutely.
All right, give me a cue.
The bar is open.
It is. And so, Chris, what do we have on tap today?
Well, today it is truly a really special day. We have Mr. Charles Person, and Mr. Person has written a book called The Buses Are A-Coming, about his time as the youngest of the Freedom Riders. So we're going to be talking about this incredibly important moment in the civil rights movement with somebody who was actually there. And the reason, again, that I find this so exciting is we're talking to somebody who made history here, and we don't really very often get a chance to do that. So that will be our topic today. So Mr. Person, it's so good to have you with us. We're so excited to have you here. We have lots of folks tuning in. A lot to unpack here in the book, and so I just thought I'd start with kind of an opener here and ask you, in the book, you say, each generation lives in its own bizarreness. So to help set the stage, although it might seem obvious to some, what was your generation's bizarreness? What just was so odd, so wrong?
Well, thanks for having me. One of the things that was outstanding for us is the fact that we were taught that things were separate but equal, and all we could see was that there was separateness but no equalness, and it was hard to adjust because our lives were dictated by signs. There were signs everywhere that told you what to do and, of course, what you could not do, and that was the bizarreness of our time.
I imagined that it was. I think it's so hard for people today to understand what growing up might have been like in Jim Crow segregation, under Jim Crow segregation. I mean, it's so long ago and distant from us, and yet it's so much a part of your life and the life of the people that you grew up with. Can you give us a sense, for you growing up in Atlanta, what Jim Crow segregation meant to you at that time? That we're talking mostly in the late 40s, in the 1950s.
Well, one of the things that I think stands out readily is in schools. Each school had its name, but you had chairs and other pieces of equipment that had the name of a white school on it. So when the white school got rid of equipment, well, we got it. So we were experiencing the hand-me-downs from all the particular white schools in our particular area. And it stood out because I couldn't figure out, well, why is it that we never got brand new stuff? It was always something that was, left over from some other institution. And it weighed heavily on your mind because everybody, even kids, like things that are new and shiny. That's the part of growing up, is to have those kind of things in your life. But for us, it was whatever was cast out, they gave it to us. And many times books were missing pages, pages were stuck together, or it was just it had a great impact on you growing up, knowing that this is how, this is what, and you were expected to do well on the test. When we got to high school, they expected you to do well on the SAT or the ACT test. But, along with a curriculum that was not suited for us, and with obsolete and battered textbooks, we were still expected to exceed. Yeah.
But Mr. President, you say that the children in your community, they all have this really unpleasant rite of passage where you say they have their awakening, where the world as it is, they become aware of it or cognizant. What was your awakening, and kind of what was the impact of that on you?
Well, it's twofold. I think one was the fact that on riding the bus, so the city bus, we had to sit from the rear. And as the bus filled up one way or the other, your seats were adjusted that way. Also, when you would go to restaurants, of course, if they even allowed you to eat in house, it was always set aside. But normally, you were only allowed takeout in most of the restaurants. It was interesting because one of the places that I worked growing up, there were a lot of foreign students who came in, and many of these foreign students were as dark as I, but they spoke a different language. Well, they spoke another language, and they were allowed to be served, and they enjoyed a lot of things about life that we as locals could not.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because when I read that, it really struck me. But at the time when we were living through this, did you talk amongst yourselves about this, or did anybody comment on just how disconnected this seems when you were, foreign exchange students?
I don't think I was able to talk to anyone who understood. We just knew that's the way it was. But what really bothered me is that some of these students were from a school that I later wanted to attend, and I couldn't even enroll in that school, and yet they were able to enroll. And like I say, they were as dark as I was.
Yeah.
But I would learn to understand that there were exceptions. Even in the segregated South or under Jim Crow, there were exceptions. They made exceptions. I had no control. We had no control. But it was very difficult because you didn't know what your role was. The signs told you a lot, but a lot of times if there was a misstep, you were reminded of your place. And as a child, you were confused because you watch other kids and you wanted to do the same things that they did, and yet you were not allowed to, for the simple reason that you were not the proper color.
Right.
So you're a good student in high school. You get into MIT because you're interested in science, which is amazing, but you can't afford to go. You can't go to Georgia Tech because they're not admitting black students at this point when you're a graduate from high school. So you end up at Morehouse, which is a historically black university in Atlanta. And you could have just kept your head down and put your head in your books and studied and kind of ignored what's going on in the greater world, but you made a very conscious decision not to do that and to get involved with the Atlanta student movement and the sit-ins that are going on in lunchrooms in Atlanta, which is a trail that eventually leads you to the Freedom Rides. But why did you make that decision? What prompted you, Charles Person, to decide that you're going to be an activist at age 18, at the tender age of 18?
Well, as a child, I was complaining about the unfairness of Georgia Tech and Emory and some of the white institutions. And my grandfather, he just said, are you going to just sit there and complain and out about it, or are you going to do something about it? Now, in the '60s, there were no 4-year programs in nuclear engineering, and I had gone to Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, and it was love at first sight. And I was just determined that I was going to be in somebody's nuclear program. And even though Morehouse didn't have one, but they had a great mathematics department, and also uh, the other sciences, they had renowned professors in those particular fields. So it made it easier for them to make the transition. But I got on campus at a time when the sit-ins had started to bloom, and we were trying to do some of the same things the kids did in North Carolina. So my arrival on campus was really timely, and I was able to be ushered um, into the program. But see, early on, they would not allow freshmen to participate because, well, we hadn't acclimated and things like that. But after the need for more and more bodies became apparent, then they allowed freshmen to become participants in the sit-ins.
So, one of the things I've always been curious about, Mr. Person, is um, how the civil rights movement really takes off. Are there people organizing youngsters like yourself, or is it more of a case of it's youngsters like yourself saying, "I've had enough of this, and I'm not going to do this anymore, and I'm going to change something"? And so does the movement build kind of from the bottom up or from the top down?
Well, our movement was basically student based. We had Lonnie King, who was the president of the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. We had Julian Bond there, who was a quite an excellent writer who could articulate our demands. We had people like Rosalind Pope, who wrote the Appeal on Human Rights. So, but it was just we had come together who had various experiences. Lonnie had been in the Navy, and Julian had, he came from a very renowned family, a professor. We had a lot of people who were involved, and I guess by working together and people involved in those things that they could do best. Like we needed someone to write articles about the student. That was Julian. People who were the lead, who had been seeing the military leadership, like Lonnie, and there were others who added certain attributes to the movement. So it was a hodgepodge of us coming together, but we utilized everyone's talent. And that was the neat thing about it, because it didn't matter whether you were male or female, you could bring something to the table. And it was very, I guess, it was very fair. If you had something to add, you were listened to, it was evaluated, and it was implemented. If it was, if we felt it would work, if it didn't, it was just cast off.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're involved with this Atlanta student movement and you're doing sit-ins, you are arrested and you have to sort of confront really I think what would be a huge fear factor to be a black person demonstrating in this southern city and being dragged off by the police. Describe what that was like, and kind of what it did to you, or how it changed you, how it made you feel.
Well, Atlanta was hoping to become the city that it is today. So they were a lot milder in their approach to us. In other words, the police had their dogs, but they kept them in check. They didn't use them like they were used in Birmingham. Uh, we were orderly, escorted to a paddy wagon, and we were taken downtown, and we were booked. And that was terrible because the city jail was an atrocious place. The smell was horrendous, and fortunately, we only stayed there overnight, and we were booked in a larger, brand new jail on Jefferson Street. It had pastel colors. They piped in music, so the transition was beautiful. but we didn't have the fear that I guess you would normally have. The only thing that made jail very difficult was they didn't let the students book the students together. They put us in with regular prisoners. So that was difficult because I was with two guys who, they're minor crimes, but yet and still they were regular prisoners, and they couldn't understand, why we would voluntarily come to jail. But after a while, they understood, and they would when we would sing freedom songs in jail, they would join in, and it was really we began to bond with them as well, and they really hated it when we elected to bond out of jail because a lot of conditions for them changed. The food they say would change, and also the temperament or their treatment. But while we were there, it was good for everybody. And
But
I
you,
think we recruited some people because they realized that okay, it's okay to go to jail for a good cause or for a noble cause.
but you ended up in solitary in that experience for 10 days, didn't you?
Yeah, I was. They said I was singing too loud, or I was.
Well, I would lock Rick in solitary if he sang too loud.
So they put me 10
Or
days
sang at
for
all.
singing too loud. That was
Wow.
my punishment.
Wow.
So, Mr. Person, let's just say that when I was in college, I did some things I probably shouldn't have done, and I got in a little bit of trouble, and my parents were not too happy about it. You're a freshman in college. You've been arrested, locked up. You're put in solitary confinement. I can only imagine. You're fighting something, which what we're talking about. But what was your parents' reaction to that? And I guess the larger question is, what was the reaction amongst the older members of your community to what you young people were trying to do?
Well, my mother and generally the women in the family, they were really upset. But the men, or I guess, they supported us, and they were able to allow us to continue because as mothers want to know what you're eating, where you're sleeping, and all those kinds of things. And I later found out, and because we never really talked about it, that mom really took it very hard initially. Pardon me, but after a while, with the consoling of my father and my grandfather, uh, she more or less relented and realized that it's something that had to be done because you got to realize we weren't the first blacks to try to rebel against the system. Others had tried before us, and we were not thinking that we were going to change the world, but we felt we had to do something. The expectation was not, uh, you know, we didn't know what to expect. Really, we really didn't know what to expect. But the idea was to do something, and that's why some of the things we did, like the sit-ins, which were new. Then we had wade-ins. We had church where we kneel in at church. All kinds of different tactics to try to be successful because we didn't know what was going to work, and we didn't know how the community was going to respond. But one of the things that helped us probably more than anything was we trying to articulate and define what we were doing and why we were doing. So it wasn't like, well, why are those kids out there in the streets? They knew why we were there because we had told the community that this is for us. This is for all black people, all for minorities. Because in the Jim Crow South, it didn't matter. Uh, it was not just a black and white thing. On the Jim Crow, they hated Mexicans, they hated Catholics and Jews, and basically any foreigner. If you were not an Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you had a problem living in the segregated South.
Right.
Mm. So you applied to become a freedom rider, and I think it's important. One of the things that was kind of new to me reading this book, because I grew up in the 60s, I was certainly familiar in school from the freedom rides, but I didn't realize that there was one original freedom ride. Okay, when we say the freedom rides, it's not like there's a bunch of stuff going on. This is an idea that somebody's had, that you apply to be part of and get accepted. So how did this all get started? What was the idea of the freedom rides? Who started it? How did you get involved in that?
Well, we really learned after we applied that there was a similar ride in 1947 called A Journey of Reconciliation. And James Peck was probably a carryover from that particular ride. But the idea was to uh, test the Supreme Court decisions concerning interstate travel. The first one was Morgan versus Virginia, and the other one was Boynton versus Virginia. And the second one, the one that we were mostly concerned with, involved the bus stations and all the ancillary services offered at those particular places. Um, and even though the law had been passed, many blacks continued to segregate themselves voluntarily. Um, and they didn't take the signs down, even though they were told that the signs were supposed to come down. But many cities left them up, and blacks just continued to keep things the old way. And I know on several occasions when other blacks in cities saw what we were doing, they sat in the front, or they would follow us because they said, well, hey, they'll do. We had explained to a lot of them that hey, the law is in your favor. This is not an act of civil disobedience because the laws had
Right.
been passed and it was in our favor. So we were not in disobedience, but we were just really just looking at the level of compliance by the various states and
So,
cities.
so one of the things I found amusing, and there are certainly amusing parts of your story, is that you're 18, you get accepted to do this, but you need your parents' permission. And Charles, you're not completely honest with your parents in this situation, are you?
No. Well, I was half truth. I told them about the advanced training in nonviolence, which we were going to get in Washington, D.C. However, I didn't tell them about the testing coming back south. That part they didn't know until May 13th. And that's when
Mm.
I was able to confront them and tell them what we had done and what we were going to continue to do. And reluctantly, uh, uh, mom complied with dad and all the other men in the family.
So, Mr. Person, Charles, how many freedom riders are we talking about in this first effort? I mean, how many of you are applying? How many of you are volunteered and gotten
I
on the
don't know
bus?
how many volunteers they had all together, but I know there was several from Atlanta, and they had. I guess the cutoff was 13, uh, but there were several people who could not participate, like John Moody, who from D.C. He couldn't participate, and there was Julie Aarons in New Orleans. She was selected, but she was already in jail, so they had to get replacements for them. But eventually, they also both became freedom riders in the end. So, but initially, I don't know how the number 13 came up, but we had replacements along the way. You remember, we
Yeah.
picked up several students in South Carolina to augment us because of people had to leave for short periods of time. But we wanted to keep the numbers such that everyone had a role. So, you had to have a certain number of people. For example, we always had a spotter, someone who was going to be there in case someone was arrested to provide bail money, someone to let people know what was going on or where they were. In some instances, that was necessary because in some towns, uh, it was a common practice in the South. If you arrested someone, a black person, they would release them at night. And, anything can happen at night. We always tried not to do anything at night. If you look at the freedom rides, we were off the roads, or by the time the sun went down, because we knew that the cover of darkness, anything could and would happen.
So uh, I want to talk about I have a picture here I wanted to show, which is the this original group of freedom riders, and you are there is sitting down second from the left, if I'm correct,
That's
right?
correct.
You
That's
you
me. Yeah.
You are a very young looking man. So what is interesting about this group that may be surprising? First, it's black and white people. Secondly, this is not all students. You're the youngest, but you have people here who are in their 40s, people who are in their 60s. It's quite a diverse group of people who are involved in this testing process, isn't it?
Yes, we were quite diverse, but somehow the uniqueness of that group is how we bonded. It's just amazing. The Bergmans, for example, they were the oldest couple there, and they told me that they would take care of me, and they tried.
And that's
So-
you with Mrs. Bergman there.
Yeah.
So.
Charles, could you tell us? I mean, in the book, you do a really fantastic job of talking about how tightly knit the community was where you grew up and your world in Atlanta. And then all of a sudden you take part in these freedom rides and you're seeing parts of the country that you've never seen before, and you're interacting with people that you never would have interacted before. And you talk, I think, really movingly about you meet this diverse group of people, white people, old people, couples who have all come together to take part in this, and your reaction to that. What was your reaction to that, to a more diverse group of people kind of fighting against this?
Well, one of the things we knew in the Atlanta movement is that I knew who had my back. I knew that I could depend on Frank or Leon or whoever I was with that particular day, and I was really concerned about the level of support that I would get. I didn't know I knew that they had experience in nonviolence and in civil disobedience, but I didn't know if and when things got tough, could I depend on them? And I later found out that I could not have asked for a better group of supporters or colleagues to work with, because it's phenomenal the dedication they had to the cause, and they didn't have to. They were had very successful lives, and yet they were willing to put it all on the line for me and for others, blacks, people who would never know, and even now many have no idea what these people did, and they're the heroes, because unfortunately, uh, many of the people that we talk about in the book you've never heard of before, but I'm dedicated to them because they made it possible. There's the simple things that were provided for us. I mean, not only the ones who were active participants, but there are those people who made signs, who provided food, provided lodging, all the little things of a grassroots organization, and that every little cog was important because it contributed to our success.
So, Rick, can I just interrupt? 'Cause I want
Go for it, Chris.
Yeah. So there's a passage in the book, and this ties into what you just said, that really struck home to me, not only in relation to your story, but in relation to history. You say that there are many names history ignores and students never learn because we monumentalize leaders into giants. Ask almost anyone in America about Dr. King or Rosa Parks. Before they were of school age, most know Dr. King had a dream and Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with building monuments to giants. The monuments give us heroes, calling us to be our best. But in seeing the monuments, we miss the cement that is the ground mass and the binding material making the monument possible. So, could you take a moment and talk about some of the cement, some of those people, just even mentioning by name, that people should know about, that were important to this movement?
The freedom rides, they had to provide some measure of lodging for us each day, and also meals. We had mass meetings almost every night at various churches, and the parishioners would put us up. And here you're staying with someone who you don't know. You're eating their food, staying in their home. There was a tremendous amount of trust that went on. But these people gave us the best that they had. And there are some memories that I can never forget. Some of the most memorable meals ever served, and the conversations. because they were hoping for a better life on all these different cities. People were wanting a better life, and they were willing to help not only financially, but they provide this, the lodging and the things that we needed to continue the rides. One thing that was very important, uh, James Farmer, he insisted on, is that he says, uh, we have to have an allowance. He said this, the saddest thing would be if you someday you would go into a lunch counter, order a meal, and they eventually served you, and you didn't have the money to pay for your meal. So it was very essential that each evening they would take up a collection at the churches, and that was the seed money to provide our allowance. And they wanted to make sure that we were able to handle our expenses, but also they encouraged us to say, if you are served in one of these places, tip liberally, because we wanted to let the servers know that we appreciate them doing what was actually normal.
I want to come back to this theme of heroes whose names we should know, but I think we need to progress a little forward into the freedom ride itself.
Yeah.
You're starting in Washington. Your goal is to go to New Orleans, not to do it as fast as you can, but to take basically 2 weeks, lots of stops, hopefully lots of publicity, kind of see how things go. And you do run into some violence in North Carolina, but when the real searing hate-filled violence is what comes on Mother's Day of 1961, when you are leaving, or you're kind of first kind of get your idea of it when you're leaving the Atlanta bus station headed for Birmingham. So set the scene for us that day of kind of what you find out before you're on the way, and what goes on, what happens.
Well, one of the unique things that happened that morning was that, the night before they allowed me to stay at home, and I was able to talk to my parents and finally get their permission. And when I got to the bus station the next day, I was given a telephone number on a scrap of paper. Now, normally I would have put this in my diary, which I always kept in my inner pocket in my jacket, but for some reason I put it in my pants pocket. That was unusual. Secondly, it was a beautiful day, and we had no problems until we got to the Georgia-Alabama line. And a fellow was getting off the bus, and he says, basically, you've had it good here in Georgia, but you in Alabama now. Well, I wasn't worried about this guy because he's getting off the bus. But little did I know that in a couple of hours I would see him again in Birmingham. And the way he was dressed is no way you could not remember him, because it was May, and the guy was wearing a long sleeve flannel shirt and bib overalls, and the colors just stood out. So, that's how I remember him. But like I say, I didn't anticipate seeing him, again. Uh, it was just a wonderful day. I mean, it was really, it was a beautiful Mother's Day, a day to relax. And, the earlier part of the ride was fantastic until we got into the state of Alabama. And that's when things began to change, the temperament of folks, of getting on and off the bus. You remember in those days, there was no FedEx or UPS, and the buses carried everything. You might have chickens, a bag of, a crate of chickens underneath the bus, or magazines, newspapers, and all that kind of stuff. So the buses not only carried passengers, but they also carried a lot of cargo to going to the various cities along their route.
So Rick, do you wanna? We have a lot of questions. You wanna?
Well, I'd like to just do one follow up, and then
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Then
No,
you
yeah.
can look at what ones you wanna take
Yeah.
next. So there's two buses. You're in one, which I think is a Trailways bus, and the other is you guys had switched back and forth. The other is a Greyhound bus. What happens when you get to Anniston, Alabama? If I'm saying that right.
when we got to Anderson, for some reason, the Trailways bus station was closed. There were people outside milling around along with a policeman. And the bus driver, our bus driver, gets off and he talks to some people and he gets back on. He says, I understand that the Greyhound bus has been set afire and they're taking the occupants to the hospital by the carloads. Now, we knew that our friends were on that bus. However, we had no idea, no way of knowing how bad, if they were injured at all. So that was quite a bit of consternation, a little bit of worrying, because we at that point we didn't know what had happened.
And right, and so then I'm sorry, I'll just follow through on this. But then you run into your own. I mean, I don't mean to make you to relive this too intensely, but you run into your own violence on the bus there. From people who've already gotten on the bus. Essentially, they had a plan, you had a plan, and they had a plan, and your plan involves nonviolence, and their plan involves a lot of violence.
Yeah, the bus driver said that he was not going to move the bus until the blacks got to the back of the bus, and of course, we students we refused. And at that point, there were about 8 men got on the bus. And they started punching us and trying to force us towards the rear of the bus. And they were being successful until we got midway of the bus. That's when James Peck and Dr. Bergman came to our aid. And that really infuriated them to think that white men would come to the aid of these black students. And they really took out their hatred on Dr. Bergman. They knocked him to the floor of the bus. And they began to stomp in his chest, and had his wife, Frances, hadn't begged them, they probably would have killed him on the bus. But James was a frail little man, and and also he was a bleeder. So when they knocked him to the floor of the bus, his blood covered the floor of the bus. And you have the situation you have is that you're forcing the students, we're stumbling over Dr. Bergman, and we're slipping on James's blood. And we got near the back of the bus, and they physically threw us to the back of the bus. And one eyewitness says they stacked us like pancakes. But once they got us in a pile in the back of the bus, they said midway of the bus, and they taunted us all the way into Birmingham. And we took an alternate route into Birmingham because our bus driver had been warned that a mob was awaiting for our bus. And had they firebombed our bus, I don't think we would have had the energy or the strength to get off. But it took us 2 hours to get from Anderson to Birmingham. And if you've ever taken that route, you know it's not a 2-hour ride. But they call us every conceivable name, and the white freedom riders every conceivable name you could think of that was nasty. But that's, they were really, and it's not so much what they said, because the N word has been used a lot. But it's how their faces were contorted with hate and the venom that to me that stands out more than the words that they said. It's the look on their faces and how I could generate that much hate in someone who had never seen me before and who didn't know me. But that's those are the images that stick with me, is how I could generate that much animosity.
So, Mr. Person, I want to bring in a couple of questions, because I think as we talk about the violence here, this is the question that everybody wants to have answers to. And so I'll put this up, and then I want to add to it. But Dave Borle.
Oh, I've stopped hearing Chris. Can you hear him, Charles?
No, there's writing.
I'm going to read that question while he can check out what's going on there. But the question is, could Mr. Person describe nonviolence training, how people are taught to remain nonviolent in the face of violence against them? And there's a few different questions about this. I mean, people are, how do you stay nonviolent in the face of people wailing on you?
Well, the training, we had certain anticipations of the level of violence. We figured they might squirt ketchup on you. They might spit on you. They might even put a cigarette out on you. Of course, they might yank you off a stool. And those are the type of role we played. But James Farmer, he wanted to make sure that under all circumstances we remain nonviolent. And he knew that if you confront someone face to face, it's okay, you're easy to deal with. But he was concerned about someone who would come up from the side or the back, and your natural reflexes would come into play because we not only were nonviolent, we didn't block any punches, we didn't cover up. The only time we took any protective measures, if you were knocked to the floor or to the ground, you would assume the fetal position. Also, if females were involved, the men tried to interpose themselves between the attacker and the female to protect them. But that's the only protective measures that we even sought. Uh, it takes a while, but there were other things that went into play. For example, we prayed a lot and we sang a lot of songs, and I think that fortified us. And if you look and listen to the lyrics of the various songs that we sang, and we altered the lyrics according to the community that we were in, that made it personal, whether you're talking about law enforcement officer or people in the community. So these were binding types of actions that we took that I think cemented our relationships with each other. And also, like I said earlier, you knew that your tester was good, had your back. That's one thing you were assured of, that you were not alone.
So a couple of other questions that have come up from our audience, and one asks, what was the attitude of the bus drivers? And the same person actually asked, how did the white people on the buses react? We know how some of them reacted because you've told us, but presumably there were some white people who were not in the group that were attacking you, I hope.
Well, that's the hard part, and I guess one of the apologies we need to make to those passengers who were caught up in something and didn't know what was going on. I remember one rider was really afraid, and one of the riders says that I'm sorry we got you into this mess, and the rider says I'm sorry that you did too, because they were just they got caught up in something. They were not a part of our group, but they were just normal passengers. But it brings out a point that we took regular buses, we paid full fare just like everybody else. Why should have been treated any differently? And a lot of people think we were sponsored by others. Well, who helped us was just grassroots people who were looking for change. We were not a corporate. There were no corporate entities providing us with any support whatsoever. It's just everyday people in various communities throughout our route who provided us not only financial aid but also lodging and food.
I don't, this may sound like an odd question, but were you aware of what you were doing? I mean, as far as of the important historical moment you were taking part in, or are you simply trying to just take the bus from point A to point B? And following on from that, what was your impression of the reaction to the freedom rides, and then particularly that violence on that Mother's Day? Because of course, photographs of this go all over the world. I mean, were you aware of you were part of something like this?
Well, you have to realize there were several things that are precursors to what we were doing. You had the Montgomery bus boycott, which had been successful. Also, you had the murder of Emmett Till, and these things were very impactful to those of us, and especially the Emmett Till murder was because he was a teenager, just like we were, and I think we just realized that something had to be done, because they could have the audacity to murder a teenager for the so-called offense that he had committed. It was, we were all very vulnerable.
There's even more violence that happens when you get to the Birmingham bus station, and it's a we don't need to dwell on it. For those of you who want to hear about this in detail, purchase this book. It's a very intense story, a very intense moment. What I wanted to ask about is we talk about heroes and people who don't get a lot of credit, and there's two people in the story whose names I really didn't know about, who you clearly regard as sort of being heroic. And one is a fellow freedom rider, a white man named Jim Peck, who's with you. And the other is a black minister in Birmingham named Fred Shuttlesworth. And I am ashamed to say that I did not know either of these people before I read your book. And in this photo that you see here, I think is that Reverend Shuttlesworth in the middle, right?
Yes.
And then Jim Peck is there. He's the guy with the bandages all over his face because of the beating that he took. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about these two men and why you regard them so highly.
Well, James Peck was a millionaire, and also he had been on the Journey of Reconciliation. And he was mild mannered, but he knew what it was like to be an aristocrat. But also he knew what it was like to be an underdog. And he talks about the upper dog and underdog. And he says that a lot of times people are underdogs and they are excel to the point that they rise to the top, and they forget what it was like when they were on the bottom. So his philosophy and his dedication, even when we knew that he had been beaten very badly in Anniston, when we got to Birmingham, he still wanted to continue the test because we were the designated testers. And, my thing is this: if this man, a white man, is willing to do all this for me and for us, then surely as a black man or black kid, I can do. And that spurred me on because, he didn't have to be there and I needed to be there. And Reverend Shuttlesworth, oh God, this man, his church had been bombed, in his house, but yet still, he was fighting, and he knew that town. He knew the town of Birmingham like the back of his hand, and he was. They could not frighten him. They told us well after his church was bombed that maybe you should move, leave the state, and they said no way he was going to leave. He's just a remarkable man. He was. I mean, he had so many freedom riders, and he provided so much courage because, for example, the night of May 14th, we were all worn and tattered, and he had a bodyguard, and he provided bodyguards for us. And one of the things that I always find comical is that night, here you have nonviolent fighters, freedom fighters, and we're being protected by men with guns. And I always thought that was kind of you. I don't know how you would explain it, but guns were not the things that we had on our minds, but they knew Birmingham a lot better than we did. And so, I credit them for protecting us because we surely weren't going to get any protection from Bull Connor and the police force in Birmingham.
And Reverend Shuttlesworth, I mean, that's the man whose number you had in your pants pocket, isn't it?
Right.
And you lost your jacket, so this is Providence. When you were beaten, your jacket was ripped off of you, along with your precious diary that had recorded everybody that you'd spoken to. But you still had Reverend Shuttlesworth's number in your pocket. That probably helped save your life.
I don't know why I put it in my pocket because normally I would have. But I think it's I'm glad I had it because otherwise I wouldn't know who to call or where to call. And, to show you how well he knew the city, whatever landmarks I gave them as to my location, they were able to find me, very quickly. And they came in to rescue me and until they saw all the blood. And then they were concerned and tried to get me some treatment.
So Mr. Person, we have so many questions, and we're not going to get to them all, but I'm going to just kind of start running down some of them. Pat wanted to know, obviously this is happening on a national stage. What do you think about the Kennedy administration's reaction to the Freedom Rides? And for those of us who don't know, what was their reaction to the Freedom Rides?
Well, I don't think, like so many other folks, had any idea of what life was like in the South. And I think as the days went on, he learned more and more about not only our taxes, but what we were being confronted with. They had a copy of our itinerary ahead of time. So did the FBI. Uh, so we were not operating in a vacuum. We wanted folks to know what was going on. Like I said earlier, just let people know why we were doing what we were doing. And, uh, the only thing they didn't know is each day we switched buses. In other words, we never took the same bus each consecutive days. In other words, you're on Greyhound today, tomorrow you'll be on Trailway and vice versa. But the Kennedy administration, I think, as things got more intense as we went further south, their involvement became more because eventually the only way we got out of Birmingham was one of his aides, Mr. Siegenthaler. He was able to expedite our ride out of Birmingham, and because you know after they refused to provide a bus for us out of Birmingham, we went to the airport. Uh, you know, uh, we bought tickets and we got on the plane, and that was a bomb threat. We got off, check the plane out, we get back on, there's another bomb threat. We were beginning to wonder if we were ever going to get out of Birmingham because we knew we couldn't take a bus and now we couldn't fly out. But Mr. Siegenthaler somehow expedited our flight out of Birmingham, and that's the only way we got out of Birmingham.
One of the great parts of this story is, when you have left Birmingham, your ride has ended because it can't go on, and I'm sure there's people in the Kennedy administration and in various southern states are going, whew, well, okay, that's over. We don't have to worry about that anymore. And at that point, a bunch of other people rise up, led by Diane Nash and others, and suddenly there's not 13 Freedom Riders, there's hundreds of Freedom Riders all over the South, and it has a huge impact. Did you have any idea that you were going to inspire such a massive movement to follow you?
No, we were so happy because we were so disappointed that we could not continue. But when the kids from Nashville came and when they had their uh, big encounter in Montgomery and how badly they were beaten, but after that, kids came from all over. I mean, it was we had all kinds of people. We had priests, we had rabbis, and we had kids from various universities. It was like instead of doing an intern, you did an intern as a freedom rider. Um, it's no matter what was done, they increased the bail once they started incarcerating them in Mississippi. They increased the amount of bail. They increased the length of time of sentencing, but it didn't stop them. It did. Kids just continued to come. It didn't matter, what the punishment was. And the thing is, what I give them so much credit is they knew that something was going to happen to them. Their bus could be burned, they could be beaten, or they were going to be incarcerated. So they knew that something was going to happen, but they came anyway.
So, one other question I wanted to get in to Mr. Person is this is from Nancy, and I'm going to show part of it, but then we had some typing issues. But what was your reaction when, as the nonviolent movement leaned into more confrontational attitudes, and then she goes on to say from Malcolm X, Black Panthers, etc. So, as the civil rights movement evolved, what are your impressions of how the tactics changed or the attitudes changed with the civil rights movement?
Well, there all had always been that wing of who felt that being nonviolent and suffering was not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
They felt that they should fight back, but it had been proven over the years that every group that had a violent component, they were always crushed. Like the Panthers, for example, in Chicago. I mean, that was a massacre. You see what they did to Huey Newton. Then you had the move in Philadelphia. So it's just prove that nonviolence works, and it's probably the most successful way, even though the suffering by those participants probably was a lot greater. But also, it allowed us to develop allies. People realized that they could empathize with us, that we were seeking change, and we were doing it in a non-violent way, in a non-confrontational way. So you've always had this ambivalence about whether you should be violent or whether whether you should fight back or whether you should use passive resistance. But see, Gandhi had proved it, and Dr. King had proved it. So I mean, we had a formula to go by that we knew worked. It was time. Um, it wasn't a fast or rapid change, but we knew that over time you would be successful if you could hang in there.
Some people will say about the freedom rides, well, that was 60 years ago and everything is different now. And others might say, 60 years later, nothing's changed. We're still fighting the same fight. So, what do you say?
Well, I think we have made a lot of progress. I think there's yet work to be done. I think that if Dr. King was alive today, he would be pleased with the progress that we've made in race relations. But there are things that he would not be pleased with. One being people who work a full time job and doesn't make a living wage. Dr. King would not be pleased to know that we have a large number of people living on our bridges and in our parks, and he would uh, believe, like I believe, that poverty and homelessness is not the new American dream. I think that nonviolence is still the way. I just think that one has to happen is that there need to be more negotiations. In other words, if you're going to demonstrate, you need to move the demonstrations from the street into the boardrooms and the executive suites of the mayor's and governor's office and to solve the problems. But you must be well aware of what the issues are and be able and be in a position to negotiate for its success. And I think if that continues to happen, we won't have the violence like that happened after Mr. Floyd's death, uh, where you allow others to hijack your movement. You as a leader of a movement, you're responsible for those who are participating, but they also, all the participants need to know, what you're about. You need to define who you are and define your movement. And you must let the community know in some way or shape, some way or form, what you're doing and why you're doing it. Um, and I think you have to realize that there's dangers. I've had encounters with some people, a lot of the young people in the Black Lives Matter, and they try to lead by committee. And I understand that, but they are afraid. They says, well, look at the leaders in the past. They've all been killed. So what they do is they share the leadership, and then one day John, he's the leader. Next day Mary, and on and on and on. So there's no one person to stand out, and they do this because they are afraid that their leaders are going to be killed. But I says, hey, this is dangerous business, and you have to accept, if you're going to accept leadership, you also have to accept that there are dangers. But one of the things they have in their favor, you have first responders and law enforcement now that you can cooperate with to solve these problems. Whereas when we were doing our demonstrations, law enforcement and the first responders were not on our side, because who had the water hose? The first responders. Who had the dogs? The police. So things are different now. And if you take advantage of those changes, then you can have a nonviolent movement and you can be successful.
We're going to go a little bit long. Chris, go.
Mr. Person,
take it home here.
Mr. Person, could you just sit up straight and maybe lean back a bit? I want everybody to see the medals on his chest are not there for fun and games. After being the youngest freedom rider, he also served his country as a Marine in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis and in Vietnam. So it's fair to say, sir, that you have a fair amount of skin in the game when it comes to being an American. So, given the fact that America today is probably more divided than it's been in generations, what would you say to Americans about the state of our country and what we can do to improve ourselves and better ourselves?
Well, I think one of the things that hurts more than anything is that in our schools, most schools don't teach civics. And our young people, they don't know how our government functions and they don't know how our economy functions. And in the last 4 years, they don't know who a true patriot is. When you're commissioned, or when you are inducted into the military, you take an oath. And those of us who take an oath and believe in taking oaths, we abide by that. Um, I think we have become, after 9/11, we became very skeptical. And also, we become very afraid. We lost our innocence. I think that until we can regain confidence in our institutions and in various people around the country, that we're going to continue to have these problems. But you have to understand how this government's supposed to function and how our economy functions. And I think that understanding and that knowledge will allow you to realize that when people make pronouncements that are not true, you know that they're not true. You know that what the duties of our president, the members of the Congress, we know what their mission is, and you know who can do what. And but nowadays there is so much confusion. People make pronouncements, and I know they're not true, but so many people in the community and throughout the country have no idea that those things are not possible. You blame the president for stuff that that is beyond his or her control. So,
Charles Person, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we let you go, it's important, I think, to remind our audience that that bus station in Anniston is now part of the Freedom Riders National Monument. You're very involved with this. And if I'm correct, I believe that people can donate to help preserve this history, right? And I've got the link here that I'm putting up. But tell us just very briefly about what's going on there.
well, after the murder of George Floyd, I was so upset, and I had to channel that anger in a positive way. So I called the co-chair of the Freedom Riders National Park Monument. And I told Pete, I says, we know how to conduct nonviolent demonstrations and we can help. And out of that discussion, we've come up with a group called the Freedom Riders Training Institute. And it's designed, we are developing a curriculum where you can train police officers, first responders, demonstrators, and educators how to work together to solve a lot of our problems. Our first group of graduates were people who were involved in demonstrations who had done some things that were illegal. Once they take the course, I think we had 40 students, and what they've had their cases expunged, and to let them know how to conduct a demonstration and do it in a proper manner. So that's one of the things that we're doing, and we've acquired a building now, and we'll eventually have a meeting place where people can come and learn not only about nonviolence, but how they can work collaboratively in the community to solve problems, whether it's policing or any type of problems that revolves around demonstrations and First Amendment rights, and how to conduct them in an effective manner, but also a peaceful and nonviolent manner.
Well, we've put up the website for both the Freedom Riders National Monument and how to donate for that, as well as the website for the Freedom Riders Training Institute, which has a picture of you on the front page of it, so that's how people will know. You look a little different, no mustache, no glasses. And again, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us here. And Charles Person's the author of Buses Are A-Comin, Memoir of a Freedom Rider, along with your co-author Richard Rooker. I've been a co-author, so I always want to at least call out the co-author at least once. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. And we're going to let you go. Hang on so we can talk to you afterwards. So, all right, there you go. And Chris, wow, you're big and I'm small, so we're going to fix that.
Oh, right. No, I like it that way.
That was good for you? Okay.
That was good for me.
Okay. And next week, we have on a book by my friend Rob Child, who's going to be our guest. And his topic is the Black Medal of Honor recipients of World War II. And what's interesting, this is the story of 7 black soldiers in World War II who were awarded the Medal of Honor, but not until 50 years after the war, because there were a bunch of people who didn't want them to get it for various reasons. And so my friend Rob has written this book, and it's a very interesting and great story to tell, and we're going to have him on next week. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And, what else is there to say? We got a little long today. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. Yes, and we really appreciate your being here.
Thank you so much, guys. Stay safe, everybody.